Hi, I'm Dr. Liz Carter from drlizcarter.com, and today I am here with my husband Chris, and we are going to talk to you about our experience with intermittent fasting. So we've both been doing intermittent fasting for about 3 years now, so we're going to cover what exactly intermittent fasting is, its benefits for you, and then what we've learned over our journey with intermittent fasting. So what we've liked, what we haven't liked, what we actually do on a daily basis, and then kind of a nice little summary to bring it all together for you guys. So, all right, we're going to dive right on in and kind of talk about exactly what intermittent fasting is. So we look at it as a daily window of eating. So it's a restricted time frame that we're eating each day. Typically we do 16 hours off eating wise and 8 hours on. And this is meant to mimic a little bit more of how our ancestors ate, right? Where they didn't have food available 24/7 all the time, run downstairs at 2 a.m. and grab a snack, or, have a glass of wine at 9 p.m. or, coffee and milk right in the morning when we got up. Our food wasn't quite as available all throughout history. So our metabolism is kind of adapted to that, and intermittent fasting is kind of bringing that back to us, and it's got some really exciting, fabulous benefits, which is why we decided to try it out 3 years ago or so. Chris has a saying that he talks about with intermittent fasting when he's trying to explain it to people. I was wondering if you could share that.
Yeah, so basically, people have a really hard time wrapping their head around this idea of, I don't get to eat for 12 hours or 14 hours or 16 hours or any of this. And they cannot handle it. I think, oh gosh, there's no way I couldn't do it. It's too long. There's no way. So what that boils down to, in comparison to, say, a diet, is diets are really easy to conceptualize. I'm going to cut out this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to eat more greens, and it's going to be great. And then the execution is miserable. And it's really hard, and they can't do it. They have a day of like forcing themselves to just stuff down kale, and then the next day they're opening up a bag of pork rinds or whatever.
Poor kale.
Right, poor kale indeed. So conversely, so a diet, really hard to execute, but really easy to conceptualize. Fasting is exactly the opposite. So the execution of it in practice, surprisingly easy, but the conceptualization, very difficult for people. So it runs the opposite direction. But if you distill it down, what do you want to be the easier part? The execution or the conceptualizing of it? And for me, I'd rather the execution actually be doable, rather than going, boy, look at this plan I've got, and don't do anything with it.
Right. Yeah, the fact that the fasting is really just one thing, right? It's just looking at time. It's not, I can't eat these foods, I need to hit this specific calorie goal, whatever it is. And I have to say the same thing when I'm talking about patients for the first time with intermittent fasting. It's everybody's mind is kind of blown, like, wait a minute, what is happening here? And then when they actually try it out, it tends to be much easier and an easier habit to kind of keep in their life longer term. And there's a way to kind of step into it too, which we'll talk about as well. But so I wanted to kind of address some of the other ways that fasting is out there that you might read about. So we do the most common one, the 16-8. There is also one where it's suggested that you restrict your calories to 500 or 600 calories a day for 2 days of the week. I am not a fan of that idea at all. Yes. To me, it kind of defeats the purpose where, in a lot of the research that we'll get into in a little bit with intermittent fasting, it helps. Intermittent fasting actually does not damage your metabolism. It's really nice. It kind of keeps it up and not slowing down, whereas calorie restriction does. So to me, it doesn't make any sense to do a calorie restricted model. And also trying to survive on 500 to 600 calories a day sounds awful. I'd rather just either not eat or eat.
Well, and the note about keeping your metabolism going, I think that's such an important thing to address, where people think, if I don't eat X number of calories at these intervals and I don't eat 6 times a day of this, my metabolism is just going to shut down, and that's nonsense. We know that's not true.
Yeah,
you know?
well, and our ancestors wouldn't have survived, right? That's the other part about it. They had to go through periods of long-term fasting, and we're not necessarily suggesting that, but there are certain benefits to short-term fasting, absolutely. And it's shown some of the research as well as a 4-day fast, which is much longer than what we're talking about, increases metabolism by 14%, which is kind of crazy. It's huge. So,
So is a 4-day fast.
Yes, yes. So that's a different topic. This is a kind of short-term kind of thing. And the calorie restriction as well just gets a little tough if you've ever had any kind of restrictive eating disorder issues or disordered eating things, kind of getting back into that mental pattern. I've had a history of that, so calorie restriction does not sound good at all to me. Been down that road, it's awful. And it can also really kind of throw your blood sugar and adrenals off. And if you're not restricting those 500 to 600 calories to your time window, then it's not giving your body the break, which is the point of intermittent fasting, or a large part of it. You're actually letting your body recover, recuperate. It takes a massive amount of digestive energy to actually process all of your food all the time. So by giving your body this rest, you actually get a really nice hormone reset. So I'm getting a little ahead of myself. We'll get into the benefits here, but
just to put a finer point on the caloric side of things. So if we're not eating for 16, and then we are eating for the 8, during those 8 hours, I still eat every bit as much as I would have had I spread that out and say we're reverse. Say I ate for 16 and didn't for 8, basically when I was asleep. I still eat the same amount of food.
Right. Right.
I'm no stranger to food. I like food. I eat a lot of it.
Yeah.
I just do it in a shorter amount of time.
Yeah, thank you. I meant to bring that up, right? I think that's the other thing that people don't realize with intermittent fasting is that they, when they hear that time restricted window, they're like, oh, how could I do that? I'll just cut out breakfast. And then those calories go away. And that is not the point of intermittent fasting at all. You're not supposed to calorie restrict. It's only a time restrict. You eat as much as you want in those 8 hours. And oftentimes when you start doing intermittent fasting, it shifts over time, when you're hungry and what your patterns are and how much you want to eat. At least that's part of what we've noticed. But yeah, definitely not a calorie restricted approach, which is part of why I like it so much. And I think a lot of people like it too. Once they wrap their heads around that, they're like, oh my God, all right.
Right.
Great.
It's an important distinction.
Yeah, it is. It is. And then the third way that people tend to do intermittent fasting is that they'll pick 2 days a week, which I think is a lot, to do a full 24-hour fast. And that is a ton as well. I'm not as huge a fan of that as either, unless you're picking a day that you're really not doing much, because it can be really intense on your body. You can't just expect not to eat food and go about your daily life, especially in this kind of high chronic stress environment that we have, especially if you have any blood sugar issues, adrenal gland issues, hormonal imbalances. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that as kind of starting off. I think that's kind of something you can graduate to and it'll get easier. We haven't done that so much. I've done a little bit of that type of fasting in the past, but that was before I was educated and I didn't actually know that I was kind of supposed to take it easy those days. And I think there's not a lot of info out there about, you kind of got to slow down, take it easy on those fasting days. The 16-8 is the easiest, I think, to get into normal life. Yeah, and then when you read about the 16-8 online, a lot of times, or the resources that are available right now, people talk about between 12 and 8 being the window, which Chris and I will get into a little bit later when we talk about what we actually do, but needless to say, that's not what we actually do, and there's a very good reason for that. So. And
you mean 12 p.m. and 8 p.m.?
Yes, I'm sorry, yes, eating between 12 p.m. and 8 p.m. See, it's good you clarify for me. I appreciate it. Yeah, so part of what I wanted to get into too is that people look at fasting as like, oh my God, I'm going to feel so deprived and restricted, and doesn't that break down protein, right? I think that's the biggest myth about fasting out there is that I'm going to start losing muscle mass immediately. How can this be good for me?
Whoever came up with this incessant need for massive amounts of protein every day.
Yeah.
I don't know who came up with that, but they really need a stern talking to.
Yeah.
It's so out of control.
I think because, protein and fat they were hard to come by when we were, when we had to hunt for our own food, and it wasn't just, meat wasn't readily available in the grocery store. It was this massively precious resource. And then it's kind of this idea like more is better, right? And it's not. That's my theory. But,
right.
Yeah, so I wanted to give you guys a little overview about fasting in general, what your body goes through physiologically, and Chris will stop me if I get like too sciencey and help explain it a little bit. So in the first aspect, and I do have my notes here to make sure I actually say this correctly for you guys. The first 6 to 24 hours, you are breaking down glycogen, which is a storage form of glucose. It's usually in your muscles, can be in your liver as well. So you're just breaking down sugars that are already in your body, right? So you can tell that in that 16:8 that we're talking about, that's kind of where we're staying right now. When you get into the really, really awesome benefits of fasting, it's usually for a period of 24 hours or so. But there are still a lot of benefits to that 16:8, as we will talk about in the future. So that first 24 hours, you're really just working on glycogen stores. When you get into 24 hours to 2 days, this is gluconeogenesis. This is the big one where everybody thinks we're breaking down protein because you switch to metabolizing amino acids. So amino acids, yes, they are the building blocks of protein. It's important. But what happens here is that your body does not immediately go to breaking down muscle. And I think this is what we've always thought of, in science and literature of fasting, that it goes immediately to break down muscle because that's our most kind of abundant source of amino acids that we can think of. However, what research is kind of discovering is that the amino acids that are getting broken down are really more like excess skin, excess collagen, which is a big protein in your skin, junk proteins or broken down dead cells, all these things that need to be actually cleaned up. And I've heard somebody talk about it as, instead of rebuilding when you're remodeling your kitchen, you actually have to take down the old cabinets in order to put up new cabinets, right? You can't just layer cabinets on top of themselves and assume they're going to be functional. So
a really crowded kitchen.
That'd be a little tough. Yeah. So the idea here is that the amino acids that we're breaking down during this phase of gluconeogenesis is actually stuff that we're helping our body to clean up. And intuitively, to me, that makes a massive amount of sense, is that your body needs this time to rest and stop metabolizing to actually kind of boost its vitality. So that's 24 hours to 2 days. 2 to 3 days is we're getting into ketosis, so we're burning fat, which I'm sure everybody or a lot of folks have heard about the ketogenic diet. At this point, that is where you want to get with the ketogenic diet. It's by eating low enough carbs that your body goes into ketosis, which usually takes 2 or 3 days or so. And then at that 5-day point, if we're on a 5-day fast, this is where we start getting these surges of growth hormone to conserve muscle. So this is where we are maybe breaking down a little bit more muscle mass at that 5-day point. But you can see that is a long time away.
That is really long. Very hard.
From intermittent fasting. And there are therapeutic fasts that go on for 7 days, 21 days, but those really need to be done in the supervision of a medical professional, usually in a clinical setting, so people can manage and monitor, electrolyte levels, hydration levels, all kinds of things, but it is really therapeutic that way. So we're almost through the boring stuff. So explaining the benefits of intermittent fasting, right? I wanted to touch a little bit more on what happens hormonally. So intermittent fasting will lower insulin levels, which is really important in things like gluconeogenesis. In things like diabetes and insulin resistance issues. So insulin is this hormone that shuttles blood sugar into our cells. It feeds our cells. And what happens over time with a condition like diabetes or blood sugar issues, usually high blood sugar, the body stops listening to these insulin signals because there's so much all the time. So when that happens, we get this buildup of blood sugar in the bloodstream because the insulin is like, hey, I don't know, the body's not listening anymore. I can't do it, right? That's insulin resistance. So by fasting, we're bringing down the levels of insulin because we're also bringing down the levels of blood sugar. So that's really important. Let me flip my notes over here to make sure I get to tell you guys everything. So we've talked a little bit about how it raises human growth hormone, right? So I found this really interesting and definitely wanted to share that long-term studies of intermittent fasting show that the fasting strategy is more than 4 times better at preserving lean muscle mass than caloric restriction, which is pretty cool, right? Because whenever we think about going on a diet or restricting something about food or eating, it's always about caloric restriction, and then that's going to actually waste your muscle mass over time.
And when you get into that caloric restriction approach, what's the first thing you start restricting along with calories are just a measurement of heat.
Right.
You know, the first thing you start losing is all these nutrients that you want in food. So sure, you might be shedding a few pounds, but you're making yourself just inherently weaker because you don't have all these nutrients that you know your body wants. You know.
Right. Usually with calorie restriction, there's the thought that, you know, fat has to come out, right? Or I'm eating too much salt, and fat and salt are two of my favorite things to get people to eat because they are so nutrient dense and important. So, yes. Okay, so more on to the benefits. Intermittent fasting can lower cholesterol levels and inflammation. It speeds cellular repair, which we talked about a little bit. Animal studies have shown that it helps to prevent cancer. Of course, we're getting more time to recover and metabolize things. Then cancer is usually a big underlying cause of cancer is inflammation. So if we're decreasing inflammation, we're decreasing the likelihood of cancer. It can improve brain health and prevent Alzheimer's. And it also, of course, does help with weight loss, which is kind of the big one that everybody probably wants to hear about. And we talked about where intermittent fasting does actually maintain or potentially even increase your metabolism. Most of the research out there right now has been done on what intermittent fasting is: a full 24-hour fast and then eating for a day, and then a full 24-hour fast. So we don't have a lot of research yet on the 16-8 method, but I do think that both of us have seen a lot of benefits that are kind of mimicking what we're talking about here.
Definitely.
So,
yep.
Great. I thought this was going to be easier with you. Now you just make me nervous.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay. It's not your fault. It's me.
That's true.
Okay. All right. It's so hard. I'm sorry. Okay. All right. Okay.
Do you want me to not look at you? I'll look at the space right above you.
But then that'll be weird on camera. Yeah.
Okay.